Hello, I'm Richard RJ Eskow. Our technological imaginations have outraced our social imaginations, leaving us at the mercy of the exploitative few. All for All is a podcast produced in collaboration with Democracy at Work, where we explore history, science, and culture to imagine what a better world might look like and how we can get there. Today's episode, we'll be discussing the power of crazy ideas and what I call the devil's locomotive. We have seen over the past many years now, elites in corporations, politics, and the media telling the vast majority of working people in the United States and around the world that they're essentially crazy for not thinking this is the best of all possible worlds. We saw it last year during the election when Democratic aligned newspapers and commentators and politicians tore their hair out in virtual exasperation over the fact that the voters were not celebrating the economy, despite the fact that the last half century or so has been especially devastating for working people in the West. We've seen this time and time again. Republicans have thrown up a set of illusions that seem truly insane to most of us. But the real secret to building a better world and to fomenting what we might want to call revolution is to understand the power of so-called crazy ideas and the hidden truths behind them. Now, Republicans know how to exploit these ideas. The far right knows how to exploit them. Corporations know how to exploit them. It's time that we looked at them from a position of empathy. Now, I was pleased to see the word empathy used recently by a reporter. I'm unfortunately blanking on his name, a reporter who covers extremism of various kinds and crazy ideas for, I think it's CNN, and he was saying he's really found that he needs to look at these ideas with empathy to understand them. And once he does, he realizes that people are generally, in many cases, good people who believe crazy things because of their suffering. And I want to explore that from a left-wing perspective, from a cultural perspective, but I want to start with the story of the devil's locomotive. The devil's locomotive comes from a War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Now, in the the translation that I read goes something like this: a locomotive is moving, Tolstoy writes. Someone asks, quote, what moves it? And a peasant says, the devil. Now, in Tolstoy's story, other characters offer different answers for why the locomotive might be moving. It's the wheels turning, which doesn't really explain anything, or it's the smoke from the engine pushing it forward, the kind of pseudo-scientific answers. Tolstoy criticizes all of them, to be fair, but I think the peasant gets the roughest treatment of all, because Tolstoy says that peasant's mind can't be changed because he truly does, A, he truly doesn't understand how the world works, and B, he's built a kind of complete image of the universe based on God and the devil, and nothing can change that. I disagree, with all due respect. Tolstoy was a great writer and thinker, and his evolution from quote unquote nobleman to a noble person as an aristocrat is truly admirable. But I think he's condescending to the peasant a little bit here. Kind of fits with his political writings, which, while fascinating, kind of over-idealized and otherized rural people in their lives. And to romanticize people, even in a kind way, after all, is to rob them of their full humanity. Now, it's not hard to imagine anybody anywhere puzzling over a steam engine in 1869, which is when this story takes place. Trains were still an exotic technology in many parts of the world. I remember the great story of a great description by Gabriel Garcia Marquez of a woman who, when she sees her first steam-powered train as she comes out of the mountains or the jungle, describes it as looking, or in fact, as she says, "I've just seen, quote, a kitchen pulling a row of houses." I think that's a great description. Tolstoy never asks himself why this peasant might see a locomotive as a tool of the devil or a symbol of a threat. The devil, of course, represents all that is evil. But if Tolstoy felt that his peasant needed a mystical or supernatural explanation for the unknown, which is kind of already a caricature of the peasant, why didn't the peasant say an angel was moving the locomotive, or even God himself? Well, I think there's a reason for that. I think the peasant, this is, of course, my projection on a fictional character, but the peasant intuited something. Now, when I say it's my projection on a fictional character, I should add that according to some reports, peasants attacked the construction being done on the Trans-Siberian Railway because they understood it to be a threat to their home and their way of life. And the peasant's world, oppressive as it was and impoverished as it often was the only world he'd ever known. He was in a world that was in the process of vanishing. Now, as we talk about the timing of it, this was about 1869, 1870. Tsar Nicholas I built the first major railway in Russia, the St. Petersburg-Moscow Railway, in 1842. It was a state-owned project, perhaps a portent of things to come. But as he expanded, and meaning Tsar Nicholas, his vast network of railroads, his ambition went way ahead of his resources. So by 1869, pretty much when our peasant is making his observation, a wave of privatization had begun sweeping the Russian railroads. Who built those railroads? Serfs, like this peasant. They were forced to work in subhuman conditions. The mass use of serf labor, to quote one historian, made railroad construction fast, cheap, and very often deadly. Now, in an interesting phrase, once built, the railroad became, in the words of this historian, quote, "the iron arms of the czarist state," end quote. They carried peasants to grim existences wherever capital needed them for their labor, because as these railroads and the changes that they brought eradicated their rural way of life, they had to scatter, and they were being forced to scatter via railroad to the already polluted towns and cities of industrializing Russia, the only places where most of them could find work. There, these recently supposedly emancipated serfs were quote unquote free to work in Russia's rapidly growing factories, but those factories lacked even the paltry safety standards that were then being imposed in Western Europe. So they struggled to find food. They were given no housing and often had to sleep on the coal factory floor. About 1 in 6 factory workers at this time in Russia was a child. As another historian writes, these cities were, quote, that is where they were forced to migrate from their homes, were, quote, full of environmental risks and problems, often overcrowded, industrialized, and equipped with quite primitive sanitary technologies, end quote. In other words, they were filthy. The rivers were used as toilets, leading to mass disease outbreaks and social unrest that goes as far back as the St. Petersburg cholera riot of 1831. So yes, the peasant was wrong on the specific force at play. The devil didn't push the locomotive, but he sensed, I would argue, something important that the other characters in the story did not. There was an entity of sorts stalking the land that he lived in. It was transcendent, invisible, and malevolent. And yes, in a way, it propelled the locomotive, that creation of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. That creature, that invisible anti-deity stalking the Russian countryside, brought poverty and economic inequality, the rise of capitalism, nationalism, and war, and the lethal war ambitions of a struggling but still ambitious empire. So yes, he was wrong on the specifics, but he saw the truth in a metaphorical sense. He saw the locomotive, its true nature, its implications for the future, more than anyone else in Tolstoy's story, maybe even more than Tolstoy himself. Now I'm going to go to the philosopher Georg Lukács, who wrote about Faust, of course, Faust being the story of Mephistopheles, the devil. He writes of Mephistopheles that, quote, Satan's naked greed for gold is something widespread and general, something which holds good for all societies that are divided into classes. The specifically capitalist significance of money as an extension of man, as his power over men and circumstances, is represented only by Mephistopheles, end quote, he says of that story. The quote he has in mind, I believe, is Mephistopheles saying to Faust that he may not be a man or a creature in the sense that of having two arms and two legs, or he may be, but Mephistopheles says, and I quote a rough translation, if I can pay for 6 stallions, if I can buy 6 horses, are not their powers also my own? I race about, and a real man am I, as if I had 24 legs, that being, of course, the total number of legs of 6 stallions. So think about the railroad then. Hundreds of miles, perhaps thousands of miles of, well, certainly thousands of miles of tracks, many hundreds, perhaps thousands of railroad cars, each with, I looked it up at one point, I think an average of 20 wheels. So you have perhaps 200,000 wheels. So not only is Mephistopheles now like a man who can get around on 2 legs, he is also a superhuman robotic creature with 200,000 wheels. In other words, he's Elon Musk's wet dream. So sure, yes, the serfs lived under terrible conditions, and we know that. And Tolstoy's everlasting credit, he rejected the privileges of his birth and fought those conditions. But emancipation for the serfs would become bitter. Whatever the peasant loved of his world, and surely he loved the land, the creatures, the peace when it was peaceful, was about to be taken from him. So who was the fool here? The locomotive in this case is Mephistopheles, right? It's capitalism, and it's a runaway train. And a little postscript on Tolstoy, I thought afterwards as I was putting these notes together that it was a locomotive that killed Anna Karenina too, right? She throws herself in front of a moving train. What was Tolstoy trying to say there? Let's talk about another idea that many of us on the left would conclude was also crazy. A Hasidic rabbi once said, quote, let's start with this, once said, and I quote, man is the, meaning I would say humanity in our non-gendered age, humans are the language of God. It's kind of a cool quote in a way, regardless of what you think about God. It is a sense that if we're the language, then maybe DNA is the alphabet of that language. My non-believing grandfather, good socialist and union leader that he was the son, perhaps the rebellious son of a Hasidic rabbinical judge, high court judge in the Russian Empire and what is now Ukraine. They called people like him a dayan. The 19th century rabbinical courts of Eastern Europe, his courts, or rather I should say the Russian Empire, the courts of my great-grandfather and others like him, according to Elie Wiesel, were in the latter part of that century, quote, suddenly endowed with a messianic dimension, end quote. And according to Wiesel and the historians he cites, they were swept by dark and ominous prophecies. Judges spoke of the armies of Gog and Magog, those forces of the end times, and their quote, quoting Wiesel, their gigantic apocalyptic war, end quote. Now, those rabbinical judges, like my great grandfather, were wrong on the details too. But something very much like Gog and Magog was about to bring an apocalypse to their world, the world of the Russian Jewish culture, the Eastern European Jewish culture, just a few decades later, first in the waves of Cossack attacks, but most definitively in Germany in the form of the Third Reich. Nothing of their world remained, and that is an apocalypse. Was that just coincidence rather than intuition? Were the judges just spouting superstition without any instinctive understanding of what was coming? Maybe, but I'm not so sure. I think we have a lot to learn from people with intuitive insights, those of us who are perhaps more educated and sophisticated and attuned to the modern civilization would call ignorant. These people may have insights into things that we, or certainly the mainstream intellectual and economic culture, have yet to understand. At a minimum, they know more about their own lives than we do. If only for that reason alone, they deserve to be heard. Now, let's go with a truly insane idea from the movement that swept this country for several years, known as QAnon. Now, I get this anecdote from a book called Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. This was published in 2023. The author was Will Sommer. He spoke to a woman, Will Sommer did, that said, and this was a common belief in QAnon, that she came to a protest. It may have been the one where they believed John F. Kennedy Jr. was going to arrive, even though by most reports he's dead, because she believed, or rather in her mind, knew as a fact, that world elites were keeping children in miles of underground tunnels, many of them believed underneath the Capitol building, and sort of a web working all across Washington, D.C. They called them the mole children. They believed that the world elites, billionaires and politicians and so on, and movie stars and so on, keep children in the tunnel, in these tunnels, in the dark, these greatest forces in the world, if you will, the most powerful people, committing horrible crimes against them, doping them up, leaving them in pitch darkness until they became blind, fattening them up like deer for veal, and committing unspeakable acts of pedophilia against them. This is truly insane and repugnant. But let's just challenge ourselves for a second. It's certainly insane, verging on psychopathic, to say that the powerful elites who control this country and this world are keeping our children in tunnels, blind, and being fattened for some future kill and exploiting their bodies. But it has a certain metaphorical truth. We're not educating our children about the reality around them. We're keeping them blind. We're feeding them unhealthy things in form of information as well as food, but especially information that makes them fattened up to become cogs of a machine that doesn't give a damn if they live or they die. This is what people, I argue, are intuiting. There was an important study done during the rise of QAnon, I would say in the late 2010s, maybe 2017, a very striking study using a very large data set showing that right-wing, especially working class extremists of this kind, passed around false stories, knowing that they were false in many cases for the satisfaction, I would say the dopamine rush of what these elaborate lies did. I think many of them, like this woman, probably believed them, but I think others just want to tear down a system that they know on some level is exploiting them and their children and destroying their children's future. That's something we should pay attention to, is even as we're appalled by the content of it. Now, the political scientists who did that study used the striking phrase. They said, among other things, that they want that the people who are spreading these crazy stories wanted to, and I quote, burn down the democratic cosmos. That's with a small d. They can't stand the system. They can't stand the players. They can't stand the parties. They can't stand the celebrity politicians that are being crammed down their throats. They can't stand the false narratives. So they use these alternate false narratives almost as dynamite planted in the basement of this edifice of artificiality just to blow it up and knock it down. Now, in domestic politics, people were horrified to see Donald Trump reelected, but narrative is so important here. The far right offers a narrative. Donald Trump offers a narrative. You and I may think it's insane, and we're right. You and I may think that Donald Trump presents the risk of fascism and is already imposing extreme authoritarianism. I certainly think so. I also think we had nothing close to a functional democracy in the decades that preceded him, but a pattern, a story, a narrative will beat a non-narrative anytime. Democrats haven't helped voters understand why so few of us can lead secure lives. We're pattern-seeking creatures. There's no pattern there. Most of us, I would argue, most working people in this country and elsewhere, intuitively sense that there are underlying forces behind the difficulties so many of us are facing, the precarity of our daily lives. There is something moving in the locomotive that's running us down. And if you don't give it a name, if we don't give it a name, you might as well call it the devil. Now, one of the interesting switches on the QAnon narrative is that it found huge traction in the world of yoga and New Age spirituality, which has always been associated with peace, love, gentleness. But you remember that guy with the horns on his head on January 6th, the so-called New Age shaman asking for vegetarian food, vegan food in prison. A lot of yoga people, including yoga types I know, yoga teachers I know, said, well, this stuff makes sense. And it makes sense that they would do that when you think about it. New Agers are questioning the existing paradigm, which is in and of itself a good thing to do if it doesn't lead you astray. If someone doesn't guide us in the right direction, though, astray is very often where we'll wind up. They're right to question the narrative, so I don't blame them for that. But without a clear narrative from the left, from the genuine left, from the left that I would argue you and I represent, some of them latched onto what's a right-wing mythos instead, not even knowing it was right-wing. We can judge them, we can put them down, or we can employ empathy. And most importantly, we could start telling them the true story of our lives and their lives. Now, again, they're crazy, we tend to think, but they have metaphorical insights. This gets into what Marxist thinkers like most specifically, I'm thinking of Antonio Gramsci, call dual consciousness. It has to do, don't claim to be an academic expert in these things, but it gets into the concept of hegemony, which is the idea, at least as Gramsci redefined it, of the ruling class maintaining its position not just through force, but through an ownership, a possession, a shaping of consciousness of how the world works. And I think we see that over and over again in our lives. So he says the ruling class maintains its position by dominating this consciousness or narrative. And in return, he argues that revolutionaries have to create a counter hegemony, an alternative way of viewing the world to win away leadership of society from them. Hegemony had been a term already used among others, Russian Marxists, but Gramsci combined it with what Italian thinkers had been saying probably for close to a century by that point. Italy was made out of nothing in the late 19th century. Essentially, different nation states formed to a new state. They called it making Italians, I think. So they created a hegemonic consciousness, dual consciousness, according to Gramsci, was the fact that working people internalize the world view that's been imposed upon them, but on some level inside, it doesn't fit with their own experience of the world, so they reject it. I think that's exactly right. I think that's now I would argue that it has a lot to do with some other ideas like narrative, but I would argue also that this we can draw from, among other things, neurological science. There's a concept called blind sight, and blind sight in neurology and in medicine is a phenomenon where people who seem to be partially or completely blind are able to respond to visual information under test conditions. The theory is that they're not physically blind, that their eyes and their optic nerves are working perfectly well, but they're unable to consciously process the information they're receiving from their eyes. So they experience life as being blind, but certain tests cause their brains to react in ways that show that the information is getting in there. It's just not being fully processed and synthesized. Isn't that what's happening in Western society right now? Most of us aren't economists or historians or policy wonks, not that they know that much anyway, but most of us, most working people haven't quote unquote seen the charts and statistics or read the history, but they sense it, they see it. People need ways to integrate and process all the information they're receiving. We are all struggling with the cognitive dissonance we experience when we're told that for example, the economy is doing better, or we have an opportunity society, or we just need to tweak this and that in the system in order to make things work, because we know none of that's true. Now, how do we change that? Well, human beings have always used stories, songs, narratives, all of these things to take this cloud of information that flows into our brains and organize it into a pattern we can act upon. Isn't that the mission of those of us who are on the left, those of us who want to see a better world? There's a quote from Honoré de Balzac. I will try to translate it to the best of my abilities. I would say the secret of great fortunes I'm going to adjust here, that seem to come from nowhere is a forgotten crime, that the origin secret is a crime that's been forgotten because that crime was done right. Now, of course, we have many fortunes nowadays where we can see the crime, but people understand Balzac's observation there that great fortunes are, in fact, something criminal and something that's hurting them. So, where do we take all this knowledge? The devil's locomotive? I think we all know it doesn't move train. The devil doesn't move trains. But it starts by saying the devil's locomotive is real, and we have to put it in language that people understand. The devil is that matrix of malevolent forces tearing our world apart, forces that used to be called the seven deadly sins, forces whose scorecards are like a weather report, showing climate change, a stock market ticker tape showing a few getting wealthy and the rest of us getting screwed, and an always incomplete tally of the innocent dead in Gaza and around the world. The devil's engine exists outside of space and time. Some of the fuel that drives it today won't be taken from the earth for years to come. Some of it won't be burned until everyone alive today is long dead. But we've already spent that treasure because we've traded it against our future. That's greed on a scale that transcends space and time. The punishment for that is a collective death sentence for all of us, a death sentence for the planet, and an after death sentence for everyone who has stoked the fire of that locomotive. Their fate is that they should be cursed by the generations to come, should our generations survive. Trump voters, even QAnon types, all sense that the world is in danger. Their logic, it may be warped, but their instincts are often sound. Dismissing them is often easy, but it accomplishes nothing. Their conspiratorial beliefs reflect their life's experiences, and those experiences are valid, even though they may be invisible to the typical educated liberal. We know what we know, but we don't know what they know. So let's leave it with this. That's the fire. They are likely, for example, Palestinians are very educated people. They know the Quran, many of them, which speaks of, quote, a fire whose fuel is men and stones, end quote. That's the fire, men and stones, that drives the wheels of the devil's locomotive. As night falls on the railroad line, take a long look down the tracks. See that light there way off in the distance, shimmering in the twilight like a mirage? It's no mirage. It's your future and mine. And if we don't change it soon, any minute now, it's going to pull into the station with the devil at the helm. All aboard, or let's fight for change. Thanks for listening. And as always, I welcome your comments.